A gasp escaped Richard's lips. Sophia stood there, suspended between her past and her future, a look of pure shock on her face. Then, she took another step, and another. Tears streamed down Richard's face as he rushed forward and knelt before her. She let go of the bars and fell into his arms, laughing and crying all at once. "I did it, Daddy," she sobbed into his shoulder. "I did it." "You did it, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it." That first step was the beginning of everything. In the months that followed, Sophia learned to walk again. But her journey had transformed her father. Richard looked at his vast wealth and, for the first time, saw not a symbol of power, but a tool for a greater purpose. One evening, he sat down with Andre. "What we did for Sophia, the music, the patience, how many other children need this? How many families can't afford it?" A new plan was born. Richard Blackwood, the ruthless CEO, became Richard Blackwood, the visionary philanthropist. A large wing of the estate was completely rebuilt, no longer a monument to his ego, but a beacon of hope. 2 years later, the Elena Center for Hope and Healing held its grand opening. It was a place of light and laughter, offering holistic therapies to children, regardless of their family's ability to pay. It was co-founded and run by Dr. Andre Silva, whose methods were now helping hundreds. Richard stood at the podium, not as the intimidating billionaire he once was, but as a humbled father. He told his story of his arrogance, his prejudice, and the profound mistake he had made. He spoke of the driver who had opened his eyes, and the promise to his wife he had almost failed to keep. The star of the day wasn't the billionaire or the doctor, but a vibrant 10-year-old girl with a radiant smile who walked confidently to the podium to cut the ribbon. Sophia, no longer a prisoner, had become the center's greatest ambassador. She took her father's hand in one of hers and Andre's in the other. Richard Blackwood had learned that true wealth isn't measured in stock prices, but in the connections we make and the second chances we're brave enough to take. He set out to heal his daughter, and in the end, found his redemption, proving that sometimes the most shocking thing that can happen is when a broken heart finally learns how to heal. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more inspirational content that celebrates the human spirit. Share this video if you believe in the power of empathy and second chances. But watching his daughter fade away was a unique kind of torture. The promise he'd made to Elena mocked him from the grave. He hadn't protected Sophia's light, he'd snuffed it out himself. Finally, after a week of this living hell, desperation won. He had to know, who was this driver, who had done in minutes what the world's best had failed to do in a year? He called the head of his corporate security division, a man famous for his discretion. "I need a background check," Richard said, his voice tight. "Andre Silva, former driver. I need everything." He did not explain. None was needed. Less than 2 days later, an encrypted file appeared in his inbox. He opened it with a sense of dread. The first page was what he expected: work history addresses, all confirming a man moving from one humble job to the next. A flicker of self-righteousness returned. Then he clicked to the next page: education and professional history, and his world fell apart. Richard's eyes scanned the words, his mind refusing to process them. He read them again. Andre Silva, B.S. in Neuroscience, Stanford M.D., Johns Hopkins. Residency in Pediatric Neurology, Fellowship in Pediatric Neurorehab and Music Therapy. The screen blurred. He was staring at the credentials of a world-leading expert in the very field he had spent millions on. The resume listed published articles, conference presentations, and accolades that would make his hand-picked specialists weep with envy. This wasn't a driver. This was Dr. Andre Silva, a titan in his field, hiding in plain sight. The blood drained from Richard's face. The humiliation he'd inflicted on Andre was nothing compared to the soul-crushing foolishness he felt now. Richard scrolled deeper, his hands trembling. The file detailed Dr. Silva's career, his focus on innovative, holistic treatments for children with severe trauma, and his pioneering work combining music and movement to rebuild neural pathways. It was everything he'd been searching for. Then, a name from Andre's past employment jumped off the page and stopped his heart. St. Catherine's Hospital. It was where Elena had spent her final weeks. His mind raced back through the fog of grief. He remembered late-night talks with his wife. She'd spoken of the hospital staff, but one person stood out. A young resident, Andre. He wasn't her main doctor, but he would stop by her room long after his rounds were done and talk to her like a person, not a patient. He spoke of hope, resilience, and the healing power of connection. A single memory surfaced with painful clarity. Elena, her eyes alight with a fragile passion. "There's a young doctor here, Richard," she'd whispered. "Andre. He's different. He told me healing isn't just about medicine, it's about finding the music inside someone again." At the time, Richard had dismissed it as sentimental rambling. And then came the final, devastating blow. Elena's last request, a sacred promise. He had buried beneath his arrogance. "Promise me, Richard," she had pleaded. "For Sophia, don't just hire the big names. Find the people who look for the music. Promise me you'll find someone like Andre for her." He had promised, and he had completely, utterly forgotten. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just a fool who'd fired a brilliant doctor. He was a man who had broken a sacred vow to his dying wife. Andre Silva wasn't a random stranger. He was the living embodiment of Elena's final wish, a wish Richard had trampled with his blind rage. In his obsession to control Sophia's future, he had desecrated the most important part of their past. The weight on his shoulders was no longer just grief. It was the crushing burden of his shame. He buried his face in his hands, the cold glow of the screen illuminating the ruin of his pride. The next morning, Richard Blackwood acted not as a billionaire, but as a man. He didn't send an assistant. He got in his car and drove himself. The address led him to a modest neighborhood on the other side of the city, where his luxury sedan stuck out like a sore thumb. He found Andre at a small, underfunded community clinic. The waiting room was crowded and noisy, a universe away from the hushed offices of his specialists. Through a window, Richard saw Andre kneeling to speak with a child in a leg brace, his expression a portrait of kindness. The sight was a dagger to Richard's heart. This is who he had humiliated. He waited, the discomfort of fitting penance. When Andre finally came out, his face showed not anger, but a profound weariness. "Mr. Blackwood, Dr. Silva," Richard replied, the title feeling heavy and inadequate. He forced the words out. "I need to speak with you, please." They stepped outside into a small courtyard. The power Richard wielded in the boardroom was useless here. He was just a father, stripped bare. "I know who you are," Richard began, his voice hoarse. "I saw your file, Johns Hopkins, the research. There is no excuse for my behavior. What I said, what I did, it was born of ignorance, prejudice, and a fear I couldn't control. I am ashamed, and I am profoundly sorry." Andre listened, his expression unreadable. Richard pushed on, the words now a desperate confession. "My wife, Elena, she knew you, at St. Catherine's. She made me promise to find someone like you for Sophia. Someone who could find her music," he choked on the word. "And I found you, and I threw you away. I broke my promise to her and failed my daughter. I'm not here to hire a doctor. I'm here as a father, begging you to forgive me, and begging you to help. My little girl, please." Andre was silent for a long moment. "I didn't take the driving job to find you," he said finally, his voice soft. "My mother is ill nearby. The job had a flexible schedule. It was a coincidence, or so I thought." He looked away. "I lost my son years ago, to a neurological condition. After that, I dedicated my life to helping children like him. When a former colleague mentioned your daughter's case, I felt a pull. I thought if I could just be near, I might find a way to help, not for the money, for her." He looked back at Richard, and for the first time, Richard saw the man behind the doctor, a man who understood loss. "I don't care about your apology for me," Andre said, his voice firm but not unkind. "The person you need to make this right with is Sophia. Your pride hurt me, but it's suffocating her. I will come back. Not for you, not as your employee. I will come back for her, on my terms. We work together, as partners. Her healing is all that matters. Understand?" Richard nodded, unable to speak, overcome by a wave of gratitude. It wasn't a business deal. It was a lifeline. It was a second chance. Andre's return marked a seismic shift in the mansion. He entered through the front door, a partner, as promised. The remaining team of therapists was dismissed. "She's not a project," Andre told Richard. "She's a child. Healing starts with trust, not treatment." The following weeks were a slow dismantling of the cold, clinical world Richard had built. Andre's therapy was unlike anything he'd ever seen. It happened in the kitchen, mixing cookie dough to work the muscles in her hands. It happened in the garden, packing soil into pots, focusing on the simple feeling of the earth. And there was always music, not sterile classical pieces, but jazz, soul, and folk melodies with a heartbeat. Andre would sit with Sophia, not asking her to walk, but just to feel the rhythm, tapping it out on her hands, her knees, the arms of her wheelchair. "Rhythm is life, Sophia," he would say. "It's the first thing we ever heard. We just have to find it again." At first, Richard just watched from a distance, humbled and unsure of his role. Andre put a stop to that. "She needs her father," he said one evening. "She needs to feel your hope, not just your worry." And so, Richard's transformation began. Awkwardly at first, the titan of industry found himself sitting on the floor, clumsily helping Sophia paint, getting more color on himself than the canvas. He read her stories, not from a chair across the room, but sitting beside her, his arm around her. He was clumsy, but he was present. For the first time since the accident, he was truly there. Slowly, miraculously, Sophia began to emerge. A sustained smile, a whispered question, a hummed song. One afternoon, while listening to a vibrant jazz piece, Andre was tapping the rhythm on her legs. "I can feel that," she whispered, her eyes wide. It was a tiny spark of sensation where there had been only numbness. The vast, empty mansion began to fill with tentative laughter and music. Andre was the guide, but it was the reconnection between father and daughter that powered her recovery. As the ice around Richard's own heart thawed, he wasn't just watching his daughter heal. He was healing right alongside her. Months passed, filled with painstaking progress. The journey was long, but now it felt full of hope. The day it happened was an ordinary Tuesday. They were in the sunroom, now a vibrant space filled with plants and art supplies. Andre had designed a set of parallel bars from smooth, warm wood. Sophia was holding on to them, practicing shifting her weight. Richard was there, as always, not hovering, but simply present. "All right, Sophia," Andre said softly, "just like we practiced. Feel the ground. Trust your body. It remembers." Sophia's knuckles were white on the bars. She took a deep breath, her face a mask of concentration. She looked from Andre to her father, and in his eyes, she saw not an anxious billionaire, but just Dad, a dad who believed in her. She let go with her right hand. Her body swayed. Richard's heart seized, but he remained silent, trusting. She stabilized. Then, with a grit that summoned every ounce of her will, she lifted her right foot. It was shaky, uncertain, but it moved forward. And then it came down. A single, wobbly, miraculous step. Time stopped. From the panoramic window of his study, Richard Blackwood surveyed his kingdom. Acres of perfect gardens, a private lake shimmering like 1,000 scattered diamonds. But the opulence might as well have been dust. All he saw was his failure. His gaze was fixed on a small figure in the distance, his daughter, Sophia, a silent statue in her wheelchair. He had enough money to bend the world to his will, but he couldn't buy his little girl a single step. He could still hear his wife. Elena's last promise, a whisper in a sterile hospital room. "Promise me, Richard," she'd pleaded, her voice a fragile thread. "Protect her light. Don't let the world put it out." But he was failing. The light was flickering, and he was helpless. Just then, gravel crunched in the driveway. The new driver? Richard's jaw tightened. Another stranger in their hollow, gilded life. He watched the man, a black man named Andre, get out of the car. A deep, ugly unease coiled in Richard's gut. As Andre walked toward his daughter, he was getting too close. Richard Blackwood's life was a fortress of success. Blackwood Industries was a name that commanded respect in boardrooms across the globe. His mansion, a marvel of glass and stone, felt less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to his achievements. But within its echoing halls, the air was thick with a grief that no amount of wealth could ever wash away. Every polished surface seemed to reflect the gaping hole his late wife Elena had left behind. His world, once a sprawling map of global enterprise, had shrunk to the size of his 8-year-old daughter's prison. Sophia was the sole heir to his empire and the only keeper of his heart. A year ago, a shriek of tires on wet asphalt had shattered their lives. The accident that stole Elena also stole the use of Sophia's legs. But the paralysis was more than physical. The vibrant, laughing girl who once filled the mansion with life was gone. In her place was a quiet, withdrawn child with a sorrow in her eyes so deep Richard couldn't find the bottom. He did what powerful men do. He threw money at it. The world's most renowned specialists paraded through their home neurologists. From Switzerland, therapists from Germany, psychologists from Boston. They arrived with impeccable credentials and eye-watering invoices. They brought exoskeletons, virtual reality programs, and carefully worded promises, and every single one of them failed. They could chart her muscle atrophy and measure her nerve response, but they couldn't reach the little girl who had locked herself away on the inside. Richard's frustration curdled into a brittle, cold anger. He became more demanding, more isolated. His staff learned to walk on eggshells, growing accustomed to his sharp tongue and impossible standards. He saw the pity in their eyes and hated them for it. They saw a billionaire who had it all. They didn't see the father who had lost the one thing he couldn't buy back, his daughter's joy. He managed his pain like he managed his portfolio with ruthless control. But Sophia wasn't a stock, and her recovery wasn't a deal he could close. And so, the beautiful, cold cage held them both, father and daughter, trapped in a silent, shared agony. Into this sterile world walked Andre Silva. He was just a driver, hired to replace the last one who couldn't stand the oppressive silence in Richard's volcanic temper. Andre's application was unremarkable. His references solid but humble. He was punctual, quiet, and had a stillness about him that felt entirely out of place in the high-strung household. For the first week, he was almost invisible, a ghost who performed his duties flawlessly. But unlike the rest of the staff, Andre didn't seem intimidated. He didn't look away when Richard entered a room. He'd simply offer a quiet nod, his eyes holding a thoughtful depth that made Richard vaguely uneasy. More than once, Richard saw him glancing at Sophia, not with pity, but with a look of intense, quiet concentration. One sunny afternoon, Richard was in his study, brooding over another discouraging report. He looked out at the garden and saw Sophia by the rose bushes, her nurse hovering nearby. Then he saw Andre. His shift was over, but he hadn't left. He was walking toward Sophia. Richard's hand balled into a fist. He reached for the intercom to order him away, but something made him pause. Andre pulled out his phone and a small speaker. A soft, soulful piano melody began to drift across the lawn. He knelt beside Sophia's wheelchair, not touching her, but simply starting to move. He swayed to the rhythm, his hands painting stories in the air, his feet shuffling softly on the grass. He was dancing, just for her. Richard watched suspiciously. This was unprofessional, a breach of every rule. But he didn't move, because something impossible was happening. Sophia, who hadn't shown real interest in anything for months, lifted her head. Her vacant eyes were now fixed on Andre. A tiny, fragile smile touched her lips. Andre smiled back, a genuine warmth lighting up his face. He gently wheeled her chair back and forth in time with the music. "See," he murmured, his voice kind and low. "You're dancing. Your heart is dancing." And then it came. A sound Richard hadn't heard in a year, a laugh. It was soft, like a bubble of air escaping, but it was real. Sophia's shoulders shook with it. She reached out a small hand, as if trying to touch the music itself. For one stunning, breathtaking moment, the light Elena had spoken of was shining, but Richard didn't see the miracle. He saw a line being crossed. He saw an employee getting too familiar. The brief warmth was shattered by the icy blast of his prejudice and fear. The fragile connection he'd just witnessed felt like a judgment on his failure. In that instant, fury won. Richard stormed from the mansion, his shoes crunching on the gravel path like grinding teeth. The moment he appeared, the music and laughter died. The air turned frigid. Sophia's smile evaporated, her hand falling back into her lap as if she'd been caught in a crime. Andre stood slowly, his expression calm but wary. "What do you think you're doing?" Richard's voice was a low, dangerous growl. Andre switched off the music. "Sir, I know what you were doing," Richard spat, gesturing at the wheelchair with contempt. "You are an employee. Your job is to drive, not to play games, not to interfere with my daughter's care, and certainly not to act with this unprofessional familiarity." The venom in his words was born from his inadequacy. He was attacking Andre for achieving what his army of experts couldn't. "Mr. Blackwood, with all due respect," your daughter was smiling, Andre said, his voice steady. She was responding. Richard let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "You're a driver. You have no idea what she needs. I have the best doctors in the world on her case. You think a little song and dance is the miracle they all missed." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over Andre. "You see a girl in a wheelchair and think you can be her savior? That gives you the right to overstep." Sophia began to tremble, a tear tracing a path down her cheek as she looked from her father's rage-filled face to Andre's calm one. "That's not what I thought at all, sir," Andre replied, his gaze flickering to Sophia with compassion. "I just saw a child who needed a moment of joy." That simple, profound truth was a dagger to Richard's pride. It was a direct indictment of his failure to provide that same joy. His rage boiled over. "You're fired," he snapped, the words landing like a hammer blow. "Collect your final pay and be off my property in an hour." Andre held his gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, weary disappointment. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just nodded once, a gesture of quiet dignity in the face of raw humiliation. "I understand," he said softly. He gave Sophia one last, silent look of apology. Then he turned and walked away, leaving a deafening silence in his wake. As Andre's car vanished down the driveway, Richard looked at his daughter. The light was gone. The spark he'd seen was extinguished, and the gray emptiness was back, deeper than ever. She wouldn't look at him. She just stared at the spot where Andre had been, her face a mask of fresh sorrow. The silence that followed was heavy. Quizzing for the first time, a crack appeared in the fortress of Richard's certainty. He had asserted his authority, but a sick feeling told him he had just lost something far more important. The days after Andre's firing were the worst yet. The mansion was no longer just sad, it was suffocating. Sophia retreated so far into herself that she was like a ghost. She refused to eat. She ignored her nurses and tutors. She just sat by the window, staring, her spirit seemingly crushed. Richard's hollow victory festered into a constant, knowing dread. The image of Sophia's brief, radiant smile haunted him, followed by the crushing despair that replaced it. He had acted to protect her, to maintain control, so why did it feel like such a profound act of cruelty? Why did Andre's quiet dignity feel more powerful than his own billionaire's rage? Pride wrestled with desperation. He couldn't admit he was wrong.